In my humble opinion, the Peco Electrofrog Turnout is one of the best turnouts for use on a DCC layout. I'll include a link to a couple of authoritative websites that describe why you need to make some modifications and how to make them. These are my Bibles when it comes to DCC. I can't improve on the articles, but I can show you how to make the suggested modifications. Please note that starting in 2020, Peco started to replace its line of Electrofrog and Insure turnouts with a new product line called Unifrog, with the expectation that only that line of turnouts will be produced eventually. While I've not bought one yet, if it lives up to its promise, the work you see demonstrated in this video will be largely unnecessary. The goal of the modifications we'll make are: 1. Ensure that the frog is electrically insulated from all the adjoining rails and rely on a frog juicer to power the frog. 2. Ensure good electrical connectivity to all rails by not relying on mechanical means to ensure that the current flows. In particular, we'll solder short 26-gauge wires in 4 specific places. By the way, if you're installing the Electrofrog style turnouts, performing these steps to improve electrical connectivity are still a good idea. This diagram from the Wiring for DCC website summarizes the modifications we'll make. As noted, I use a frog juicer to control the polarity of the frog because it's easier to install than a mechanical switch tied to the actual position of the point, and I think it will be more reliable over time. Here's the tools and supplies I use. Modify this list as you see fit. Of course, have your regular hobby supplies with you. Peco Electrofrog Turnout, soldering iron set at 770 degrees Fahrenheit, solder, liquid solder flux, tweezers, a third hand device, jeweler's wire snips. I found mine at Walmart in the craft section for a really cheap price. Isopropyl alcohol, 70%, micro brushes, bare copper wire, 26 gauge. Step 1. Insulate the frog from the adjoining rails. Turn the turnout upside down. Locate the 2 small wires, one on each rail, that connect the wing rails to the closure rails. Use your jeweler's wire snips to cut and remove these 2 small wires. Step 2. Solder jumper wires from the stock rails to the closure rails. You will be soldering 2 small pieces of bare wire to the back side of the turnout. One connects the outside stock rail to the closure rail closest to it, and the other from the other stock rail to the closure rail closest to it. This step ensures that the closure rails don't rely on getting their current by any mechanical means such as the hinge. Here's the recipe. Turn the turnout upside down. Locate the 4 spots where the plastic webbing has been left unmolded. On this turnout, you'll see that these spots have a bit of plastic webbing overlaying the bare rail. I removed this excess webbing with a snap blade to make soldering easier. Place the turnout upside down and weight it down. Put a drop of flux on one of the 4 spots you just prepared. Use the soldering iron to heat up the bare spot on the rail and affix a small drop of solder to the spot. Repeat this process for all 4 spots. Cut 2 pieces of 26 gauge bare copper wire a little longer than you'll need. For each of the 2 short pieces, trim it so it fits nicely over the true rails but overhangs as little as possible. Use tweezers to hold the wire and move it so that it is positioned over the 2 rails and touching one. Use a soldering iron to melt the solder drop and thus solder the jumper to the rail. Repeat this step on the other side of the jumper. Step 3. Solder jumpers from the switch rails to the closure rails. You will be soldering two small pieces of bare wire on the top side of the turnout. One connects the outside switch rail to the closure rail closer to it, and the other from the other switch to the closure rail closest to it. This step ensures that the switch rails don't rely on getting their current by any mechanical means, such as just by pressing against the closure rails. Here's the recipe. Locate a spot on the closure rail just past the first tie that is beyond the hinge mechanism. To be clear, this spot is located on the outside of the rails, so we won't interfere with the running of the wheels. Put a drop of flux on this spot. Use a soldering iron to heat up the spot on the rail and affix a small drop of solder to the spot. Now, working from the same side, locate a different spot. This time, locate a spot on the switch rail that's also just past the first tie that is beyond the hinge mechanism. Repeat the same process to affix a small drop of solder at that spot. Repeat the above process for the other switch and closure rail. With the rails prepared, we turn our attention to the two actual jumper wires. For each jumper wire, cut a piece of 26 gauge bare copper wire that is a little bit longer than the distance from one solder dot to the other. Tin the jumper wires. For each of the jumpers, trim it so that it fits nicely between the two solder dots. A little overhang is okay. Use tweezers to hold the wire and move it so that it is positioned over one of the solder spots and touching it. Use the soldering iron to melt the solder spot and thus solder the jumper to the rail. The goal is to keep the wire as snugly next to the inside edge of the rail as possible. You may need to reheat and reposition the wire slightly. Repeat this step on the other side of the jumper. Now let's clean up our work. Using the alcohol and the micro brushes, rinse off any residue along the sides of the rails. Especially look out for areas with a greenish cast. Step 4. Prepare rail webbing for rail joiners. In this step, we will cut the rail webbing in specific spots so you can easily install your rail joiners later. While not required to improve electrical contact, I offer this info only because it's what I do at the workbench to save time during installation. First, let's take a close look at the ends of the Peco turnout. At each place where the rail ends, the plastic webbing is actually molded with an undercut from the last tie to the next to the last tie. This is so thoughtful of them. At each of these places, you simply need to do this. Locate the 4 molded spikes on top of the webbing that hold the rail in place. Using a snap knife, slice off the head from each of the 4 spikes, but just the head. Don't go any deeper, but you don't have to be super precise. The result is the rail end with the undercut webbing below it. It is ready to accept either a standard or insulated rail joiner that fits snugly.